to everybody for coming along this evening, and hello to those people who are joining online. I've been working in this sort of field for the past 3 decades, and I don't know how many of you are aware of the latest IPCC report that came out in early April, but it contains some of the most kind of dire warnings about the consequences of government inaction, and it's got the kind of strongest language yet in terms of what we need to do to address the climate emergency. I don't know how many people here have seen Don't Look Up, the film on Netflix. Yeah, quite a few people. I think those people working in the field very much because it recognises the issues around government inaction. Also, I think it quite accurately portrays some of what's happened in the past. You see this meteor about to land on Earth, and yet it's not on the news agenda. It's overtaken by a trivial celebrity issue. And we often find with climate change, unfortunately, that it ends up being a kind of Cinderella issue, in that it often gets overtaken by other issues. Now, clearly at the moment, for very right reasons, the media are taken up with the war, and what's going on in the Ukraine. But the climate crisis is, unless we sort of end up having a nuclear war, is going to affect, billions of people, and it really should be headline news. So what I'm going to talk about today really is some of the factors that influence media attention to climate change and explore those issues. Now, David Attenborough at the G7 summit in Cornwall made this comment about tackling climate change is now as much a communication challenge, political challenge, as a scientific and technological one. I think that's very much the case. And it's a shame really that, we've got to this point to kind of really realise how crucial communications is in tackling the issues. So I want to suggest that the media play 3 key roles. I'm going to outline this in a moment. The first one is in terms of setting the agenda. So considering how the media prioritise particular issues and how that then relates to public concern. And there's a lot of research suggesting that there is a close relationship between the two, although it's quite complex. And an aspect of that is to do with how the issues are then framed. So here it's looking at the kind of language that is used by the media to talk about climate change. Not just the language though, also the visuals as well are incredibly important. And the choice of language and choice of visuals is highly selective and incredibly important. And then the third key role that I'm going to be talking about is the role of the media in amplifying or silencing news sources. And there is a very fierce battle behind the scenes that we don't always get to hear about, whereby news sources are competing against one another to get their voices heard, whether that's an environmental group, whether that's government, whether that's another kind of organisation, who scientists perhaps who are trying to also get their voices heard. So first of all then, setting the agenda. I mentioned at the beginning about the IPCC, latest IPCC report that came out on the 4th of April. Well, here it is. Here's an article buried away in the Los Angeles Times with the headline, "Earth on Track to be Unlivable." This tiny little headline in the World section A3 the day after. And, the question is, why isn't this front page news. You know, we're talking about the Earth on track to be unlivable, and yet it's buried away in the newspaper. And this isn't just an isolated example. As I said at the beginning, you know, very often climate change has become a Cinderella issue. It's having to compete with all sorts of other issues that are highly newsworthy, like, you know, obviously COVID, the war in Ukraine, economic issues, and so on and so forth. And much of this is to do with news values. So what do we actually mean by news values? Well, news values are a kind of sixth sense that journalists have about what the public will be interested in, what they'll be interested to read about. And clearly news is incredibly selective. It doesn't reflect reality. And if you think of a number of things that are happening right now in the world, you know, media concentrate on a relatively small number of those issues. And that's influenced very much by an inherent orientation towards covering events. So events tend to attract media attention, particularly highly visual events, you know, major political events. So, you know, I'm sure you all saw the coverage of COP26 in Glasgow, and there was an enormous amount of attention here in the UK, you know, on television news, on radio, to the discussions there. But typically, environmental issues don't tend to get that much coverage, and often they end up being, you know, buried away somewhere, or at the end of the television news programme. You know, there might be a kind of light-hearted story and environment. That is beginning to change, thankfully. It's not all doom and gloom, but you know, it's an uphill struggle sometimes to get the media interested in environmental issues. And this is something that I talk about in my book, Media Environment and the Network Society, where I focus there particularly on digital media, although I'm not really sort of concentrating tonight so much on digital media. Having said that, though, I think, you know, we need to recognise that there aren't that many people now, I don't know about people in the room, who actually read a physical copy of a newspaper. There is a kind of generation gap, I think, and certainly younger people are far more likely to get their news online, you know, through social media, even TikTok. But nevertheless, newspapers they do still play an important role because they influence the television news programs, and also they are highly influential in terms of kind of politicians as well. And of course, many people read newspapers online now. I think this illustrates part of this problem with getting attention for environmental issues. This was a report that was done by Greening the Media back in 2014, and it was based on looking at coverage of a number of environmental issues on network television news in the US. And you can see here how much attention the pop singer Beyonce got compared to, you know, deforestation and environmental justice. Beyonce got 11 times more coverage than, you know, the really important issue of deforestation. So environmental organisations have quite a problem sometimes in interesting the media in environmental stories. And often they do partner with celebrities to try and raise the profile of the issue to actually get more attention. Here's another report. This was actually carried out by a group in the run-up to COP26, and here they found that they were looking at how many mentions different words got within UK media, within television, I should say, and they found that the word cake got 10 times as much coverage as climate change. And they're also looking at, you know, other terms as well. They found that the terms of climate change, and climate crisis got a lot more coverage than phrases like climate justice, climate action. So there wasn't very much, or nowhere near as much coverage on issues around actions that we can take and solutions, which I'll kind of talk a little bit more about later. Now, you'll see in a moment that if you look over time, it's incredibly interesting to see the peaks and troughs in terms of media coverage of environmental issues. If you look over time, there are lots of peaks and dips, and these can be related to all sorts of different issues. It's quite complex, but it can be related to economic factors, economic recession, obviously competing issues, even competing environmental issues. So there are environmental issues that compete with climate change for coverage. Political agendas is a really important one. We often find that news agendas closely follow the political agenda. So if politicians are talking about something, then, and giving it a lot of priority, then the media tend to follow suit and take the prime ministerial lead. There are also issues around too much coverage seen as turning people off and people getting overloaded with hearing the same old story, and saturation of news, that can be a problem. And also, and I'll come on to this a bit later, counting the costs as well, the costs of actually taking action, which is related to a model. I'm not really going to go into any detail tonight, Dan's issue attention cycle. But you can see this by looking at what happened in the late 1980s, around about in 1988, the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, made her famous, in quotes, green speech. And closely following on from that, a lot of newspapers, including tabloid newspapers at the time, appointed for the first time ever environment correspondents, because you can see Mrs. Thatcher was putting so much emphasis on this. But by the time you get to the early 1990s, those same environment correspondents, most of them had lost their jobs. And the reason for that was that there was the war in Iraq, there was also economic recession, and the issues weren't seen as being so newsworthy, and politicians, instead of focusing on the environment, went on to more pressing issues around the war and the economy. If we have a look at this, looking at the amount of newspaper coverage of climate change or global warming from 2000 to 2022, we can see some of these peaks and troughs. So there was a massive peak here, and that's related to obviously the COP26 summit in Glasgow. There's a big peak here as well at the end of 2009. Anybody know what that peak possibly might be related to? What happened in 2009?
So Copenhagen summit.
It was, yeah. So you'll find a lot of these peaks do reflect climate summits where the world leaders come together. But another thing that catapulted the issues into the media spotlight at that time was the ClimateGate scandal. And this involved emails being hacked into. These were emails from scientists at the University of East Anglia Climatic Research Centre, and it was no coincidence that they were hacked into in the lead up to Copenhagen. And climate skeptics at the time were trying to suggest that these scientists were somehow tampering with the evidence. They weren't quite being straight with us about it. Subsequently, there was an investigation that found there was no evidence of that whatsoever. But at the time, it led to a huge amount of media coverage about ClimateGate, and editors, became quite worried. They thought maybe they'd been duped, and there was a lot of coverage of these issues. So that, together with the Copenhagen summit, led to a big peak at the end of 2009. So what is the relationship then between levels of public concern and awareness about environmental issues and media coverage? Well, it's a complex relationship. To some extent, the media reflect levels of public concern, but they also shape those issues as well, those levels of concern and awareness. Now, this was a survey that I commissioned in 2018. It was a nationally representative survey of adults in the UK. And what's interesting here is you can see that climate change, I mean, obviously a lot of these issues are related anyway, but climate change and plastic waste were the two ones that people said that they were most concerned about. So this dark blue here is extremely concerned. So we've got 36% saying extremely concerned about climate change, 36% saying extremely concerned about plastic waste. But, you know, slightly greater numbers of people saying that they were very concerned about plastic waste, and very few people saying they're not at all concerned. Now, if you think back to 2018, there was a lot of media coverage at the time about the problem of plastics, you know, the blue planet effect and so on and so forth. So there does seem to be this, it's not a simple relationship, but there is a relationship between levels of public concern and awareness and media coverage. And if we look at, this is an Ipsos Mori survey that was carried out in November 2021 at the time of COP26 summit in Glasgow, again, nationally representative survey of the UK public. And it's incredible that, you know, 40% of the public, so the highest number of people, saw pollution, environment and climate change as the most important issue facing Britain today. And prior to that, you know, as you might expect, it was coronavirus. And we had a lot of media coverage, didn't we, at that time, of what was going on at COP26. Yeah, if we have a look a month later, only a month later, same questions were asked. And here we find that concern about pollution, environment and climate change has dropped by, you know, 27%. So it's right down here. And then coronavirus, you know, was the top one. 62% of the public was saying that was the most important issue facing the country today. And then if you look at subsequent surveys, you see that more and more people are saying lack of faith in politicians, government, obviously with all the leaks coming out about Partygate and so on and so forth. So moving on then from setting the agenda to framing the issue. So second thing that I want to talk about, which is related to agenda setting, is to do with how the issues themselves are framed by the media. Oops. And what do we mean by framing? Well, the media play a really important role in defining problems by selecting certain facts over others in terms of choice of language. So whether you choose to talk about, let's say, climate change or climate emergency, those two things, you know, have slightly different connotations. Also, in terms of imagery, you know, do you choose to show a polar bear on ice, or do you perhaps choose to show protest imagery? So those kind of choices frame an issue. Climate change can be framed in all sorts of different ways. It might be framed as a health issue. You know, you could frame it in terms of the economy, all sorts of different ways, just by quite subtle often use of language. And also, you know, these two factors here, moral evaluation and treatment recommendation, are important to consider as well. So the kind of solutions that might be provided by journalists, because there are multiple solutions. And in the past, there's been a bit of an issue around balancing climate skeptics with scientists and this desire to give equal treatment to both sides of the story. That's been highly problematic, because what it does is it implies that there is still uncertainty and debate about the issues. Well, actually, we know that the vast majority of scientists, agree about the reality of anthropogenic climate change and are convinced by the science. But you sometimes get, outliers like Piers Corbyn, for example, Jeremy Corbyn's brother, who will talk about, sunspots, cosmic rays, and so on and so forth. So that has certainly been a problem in the past, particularly in the States. But we have moved on a little bit from that, thankfully, because the BBC now have, changed their policy. In the past, the policy was that you always have two sides of the story. You show the climate scientist versus the skeptic. The climate scientist who's arguing, obviously, about the reality of climate change. Now, this was helped along by climate scientist Dr. Rupert Reed, who was invited onto BBC Radio, and he was invited because they wanted him alongside a climate skeptic, and he said no. Normally, the party would have said yes, but he thought, well, no, there's no debate now. Why are you still, using this old format? And so he posted a tweet on Twitter, not expecting it to get very much attention at all. It went viral, huge number of tweets as a result, and it also ended up leading to a letter which was signed by a number of distinguished politicians and scientists that was sent into the BBC demanding that they rethink their policy. As a result, their policy changed in 2018. So moving on now to just talk about some of what's going on at the moment in terms of media attention to climate change. This is an example taken from The Sun. Now, the right-leaning media in the UK have a much greater following than do the left-leaning media. So, The Sun, for example, the Mail, Daily Mail, Daily Express, Daily Telegraph have a much greater readership than left-leaning newspapers. And The Sun at the moment, is running this campaign. It launched in 2020. The Sun's Green Team campaign, emphasising the role that ordinary citizens can make by very small actions that can contribute to dealing with the issues. So here we have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 actions that you can take in relation to all sorts of things like waste, lighting, so on and so forth. Is this a new initiative? Some people are talking about this as being, wow, this is a new initiative. Well, in some ways, it's a bit depressing when I look back over time. I was actually sorting out, because I've moved offices recently, sorting out my office the other day, and I've got stacks of old newspaper cuttings that I took from a long time ago. And I've seen so many similar articles urging us to do, what I'm actually seeing now, which is scary. And looking at an article in December 2006. Now, this was at the time when The Sun still had page 3 models, and in typical Sun style, they had this model here, Keeley Hazel, pose painted green in the sun. It says here, named by the Tories as one of the world's top 10 campaigners. Keeley 20 of Bromley, Kent said, "I'm very honoured, but the truth is it takes very little effort to go green." And then we have this satirical comment in The Guardian about this kind of approach that the Sun has often taken in the past. Turning off lights can be a big turn on, instructs Keeley, whose warming upper half has been tinged green by judicious use of Photoshop. Half the number of cars on the road by offering that special someone a lift to work. Lots of people have admired my butt. collecting rainwater for your garden in a water butt is a great way of preserving resources. Now, this kind of sort of trivial coverage, you know, is something that you often see in popular newspapers, and you know, it's not really. The problem is that a lot of the coverage is focusing on, it's trying to get individual citizens involved, but often it's not really dealing with the kind of harder systemic issues, and you know, issues around the role of industry and government. It's clearly public action does play a part, but that's not the whole story if we're to actually you know, reach where we need to be. And if we have a look at the right-wing press at the moment, this is an example actually taken from the Daily Express, which is a newspaper that in the past has had a lot of climate skeptic denialism coverage within it, but now it's got this campaign going on. You know, you see this across the top there, join the green industrial revolution, and it's taking a kind of climate nationalism angle, which is interesting. It's sort of appealing, I think, to its sort of older conservative readers and linking environmentalism with patriotism, and emphasising how technological solutions are what we really need, and we can all get on board with this. So you can see here, for example, you know, it's got the Uni Jack in green. Green Britain needs you, and it's this campaign is in conjunction with Dale Vince, who founded Ecotricity. And he's very much involved in this campaign. It's all about celebrating really, you know, Britain and how we can make Britain a stronger country by this green industrial revolution. The problem, though, is that in placing so much emphasis on, you know, Britain and green Britain and so on and so forth, what about issues of climate justice? It's ignoring that, and it's kind of, you know, suggesting that we need to just kind of, you know, prioritise our own interests. And there's no discussion there at all about, you know, the inequalities. And we know that, you know, this country is relatively, you know, very well off compared to many other places around the world that haven't contributed, you know, in the same way to the problem, and yet, you know, are suffering the consequences, and will be suffering the consequences much more than we will do. So finally then, the third role is to do with amplifying or silencing news sources. So news sources could be, you know, any sources that the media use when they're covering a story. So it might be an environmental pressure group, might be a scientist, could be a celebrity, could be a politician. So which kind of voices tend to get the most coverage, and why is that? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is this fierce battle behind the scenes to try and control the news agenda. And certainly in the US, this has been dominated very much by industry groups, special interest lobbies, public relations companies, and they've been involved in a concerted attempt over the years to try and sow the seeds of doubt about the reality of climate change. And what they've done is learnt a lot from the campaign against the campaign associated with the smoking lobby, who were trying to kind of dispel there being any connection between smoking and cancer. They caught onto that, and they've kind of exploited the news media in a similar kind of way. And just one example, the American Enterprise Institute, funded by the big oil company ExxonMobil, this was a while ago now, they offered scientists and economists $10,000 each as payment if they agreed to write articles that were essentially designed to undermine the findings of the IPCC report. And that's, that's just one example. So over the years, there has been this concerted attempt to try and deny the evidence. And clearly it's in the vested interest of, some of these big industry groups to challenge the evidence. Things have moved on though, as I'll show in a moment, since that time to some extent. I mean, this was an example of a front page piece in the Daily Express, 100 Reasons Why Global Warming is Natural, no proof that human activity is to blame in 2012. As I said, the Daily Express, well known for, in the past, having published a lot of climate skeptic pieces, but that is beginning to change, as you saw before. Now, this book here, I don't know how many people have read this book. It's a really interesting one, Merchants of Doubt, that goes into a bit more detail about some of the tactics that have been used in the past to kind of sow the seeds of doubt about the reality of climate change. This book here is a new one that's just recently come out, written by the climate scientist Michael Mann, called The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. This is an incredibly interesting read, this book. And what Michael Mann is trying to do is show how, in the early days, the emphasis was all on denying the evidence. Well, now, very few people would actually deny the reality of climate change. We can see, we only have to look around to see what's happening. But now the emphasis is very much on delay. So the type of climate skepticism that we see now has changed, and it's more about, it costs too much to actually take any action, or debate about, the speed at which action needs to take place. So it's moved on, and it's a different type of climate skepticism, but it's very much trying to delay things. And as I said at the beginning, I haven't really focused that much on social media, but clearly a lot of this is circulating on social media. And the issue, I guess, with social media is you have these echo chambers where often people are perhaps coming across information that tends to kind of reinforce their views. It tends to be quite siloed often, and because of filter bubbles that we all have, particularly if you go on social media, very often you only have to sort of like something or share something, and that is all tracked, and then you're fed more of the same material, aren't you? More and more of it. So this creates a bit of a problem in terms of trying to reach new audiences and to try and sort of broaden the audience for many of the issues that I've been talking about. So thank you very much.